After the Washington Consensus, I guess with post-2015 on all of our minds, which is more of an agenda-setting issue so far, I guess it's also very good to start thinking about what about the development strategies that go along with achieving whatever the goals will be or the target will be for the post-2015 agenda. So, and also with all the crises that we've seen in the past few years, starting with the financial crisis, food crises, I would say, and energy crises, I guess how would that, what would that tell us about development strategies? What does it tell us about unfettered globalization? We've seen it over the past decades. So I guess talking about the Washington Consensus will be interesting. Now, they're different from, I guess most people know that, from what we call consensus at the UN. That means that there are some documents you can go to which says this is the consensus. Of course, there was never a document called the Washington Consensus, which was just a term coined by an economist of the International Institute of Economics, John Williamson, of course, who put up his book on assessing the reforms that took place in Latin America in from the late 1980s into the 1990s. And they said, well, there's some common features there, along with other places where reforms have taken place, and that was then coined the Washington Consensus. So the consensus was just by fact of observation. So let's think through what this means. I guess Sanjay will explain all of that to us. So without further introduction, except for saying Sanjay Reddy is an associate professor at the New School of Social Research. And one of his interesting backgrounds is that he's not just an economist, but also a social anthropologist and mathematician and physics by training. And I also like to mention that because famous economists, or many famous economists, started their careers in physics, like my countryman Jan Tinbergen, who won the first Nobel Prize in economics. So not a bad start to start there. But without further ado, Sanjay, you have the floor. I take it you don't have a PowerPoint, but it's an old-fashioned presentation, which is very good. So is 30 or 40 minutes good for introduction? Then have I assume a lively discussion on these issues. Sanjay, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Rob. I'm very grateful for the very kind remarks and kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Sherry, also for the invitation to speak at DESA. I always feel that I'm a friend of DESA, and very, very pleased, therefore, to see all of you on a very rainy, unexpectedly rainy, at least from my point of view, June day. I think was somewhat heroic for a number of you to brave the rain. I myself got rather wet on the way. It was probably somewhat foolish of me to propose this topic. I proposed it, I would say, mainly as an act of self-indulgence on my own part, in that I wanted to come to terms, really for myself, and also, if possible, if it is of some help for others, with the question of what the Washington Consensus is and what it means today. What are its remnants or its fragments? What should we, what framework, what conceptual framework should we use to think about the governing ideas of the current moment, and in what ways they are related to the governing ideas of the recent past? And I would say that this has been an interesting exercise, one which I've not perhaps given yet as deep reflection to as one should, but in that spirit of having begun an engagement, not completed one, I'll present you some very initial propositions and hypotheses for your reaction, and I hope that in the discussion we can have a robust debate about it, about these propositions. The concept of Washington Consensus is one of those which arguably has generated more heat than light It is a concept which has become polarizing in different ways, and there is therefore a debate to be had about whether or not it is useful, even from the point of view of generating a post-mortem, so to speak, to ask the question, what was and what is the Washington Consensus? But I think it is useful, because we do need a way, some way of thinking about, again, what the governing ideas of the age are. One of the people who has spilled some ink in thinking about the question of what the Washington Consensus means today is, of course, John Williamson, who is credited with originating the term, who did originate the term. John Williamson has written a number of papers about this in the recent years. One of the points I would say that Williamson is very much at pains to make is that the concept of Washington Consensus, as he formulated it, referred to a rather narrow set of ideas, the 10 principles which he outlined in his original framing description. And he is quite critical of those who have used the concept of Washington Consensus to refer to something broader. So, for example, in a paper which he wrote in the last decade called A Short History of the Washington Consensus, he describes at least 2 other meanings, one of which he has some sympathy with, and one of which he has no sympathy at all with. The meaning with which he has some sympathy is the concept that refers to that set of ideas which happens to be regnant or to be influential in the most prominent Washington development institutions, in particular the World Bank and the IMF, and to a lesser extent in the US Treasury and in allied institutions in Washington, D.C., think tanks, and so on. So this is in some sense a purely descriptive sociological term, and it doesn't have any kind of content. It's a procedural and formal idea that it refers to whatever ideas happen to be present at a particular moment in time, allowing for the possibility that those ideas are shifting. And of course, that idea is implicit in John Williamson's own understanding of the term, though he attempted to give more content to it by describing the 10 specific principles which he believed at the time described the Washington Consensus in this institutional sense. The concept of Washington Consensus with which he has very little sympathy, he says, is that which conflates the Washington Consensus and what some might call neoliberalism. And in particular, he's quite critical of Joe Stiglitz for his conflation of the term Washington Consensus and neoliberalism as John Williamson sees it. The idea that the Washington Consensus refers more generally to market fundamentalism, encompassing all the aspects that one might think to be a part of market fundamentalism, including, for instance, the commitment to free capital mobility as an ideal, or ideas such as inflation targeting, supply-side economics and monetarism, as John Williamson describes them. These are things that Williamson thinks should be separated because he thinks they were never ideas which were broadly shared in Washington, especially in the most influential quarters. And it is not, therefore, from his point of view, helpful to conflate these two ideas. Now, this having been said, although I'm very sympathetic to John Williamson's wish not to be misquoted and misunderstood, I think that it is perhaps a bit too much of a scholastic or academicist point to insist that one must be understood in the way one originally intended. If one asks the question, why did the concept of the Washington Consensus enjoy the currency that it did in the world? Why did it become as successful a concept as it has become? Why has it been taken up in worldwide discourses on development and on economic policy? The answer is, of course, that it captured something about the zeitgeist, so to speak, the spirit of the age, which went beyond the 10 particular principles which John Williamson originally enumerated. Now, I won't, for purposes of avoiding boring you too much, describe what those 10 principles are, but we can make reference to them later on in the discussion. I will make some reference to them as I go along, and certainly they're quite easily found if any of you are interested. The concept of the Washington Consensus in the Williamsonian understanding of the term, I would say, has its clearest intellectual lineage in what one might call mono-economics, as Deepak Lal famously referred to it in his book on development economics, called The Poverty of Development Economics. Actually, I'm sorry, that was Albert Hirschman's term describing Deepak Lal's view in The Poverty of Development Economics. The thesis of mono-economics, according to Albert Hirschman's description of Deepak Lal's view, is that there is only one economics, and that one economics holds in all times and places. And that one economics prescribes one set of sensible economic policies. This idea, I think, is interesting to make explicit because it contrasts so obviously with what one might call the stagist development economics and development studies of the preceding era, of which structuralist development economics, which people like Albert Hirschman arguably represented, was one variant. But more generally, the idea that development is a process of historical transformation which involves going from, in some sense, social stage to stage with its own particular economic, social, and political content and requirements, is one which is dispensed with in the intellectual framework of mono-economics. The intellectual framework of mono-economics, rather, suggests that one can and should jump wherever one happens to be at the present time and whatever one's particular prior policy errors and the specifics of one's institutions toward the most desirable policy framework. And that most desirable policy framework, and now to bring in some of the ideas which, a few of the ideas which Williamson mentions, include such things as trade liberalization, of course, fiscal discipline, privatization, deregulation, understood in a particular way by John Williamson, excuse me. What Jeff Sachs later summarized in the very nice tripartite slogan, stabilization, liberalization, and privatization. Now, this idea has two lineages. The lineage which is most prominent, I would say, within the, or was most prominent within the development policy institutions of Washington in the 1970s in particular, which was, I think, a crucial decade in bringing these ideas to the fore, was that of neoclassical economics, influenced by trade economists and development economists such as I.M.D. Little and others, who represented a neoclassical policy position and not only methodological position as to what it is that constituted the conditions for the efficient allocation of resources. But of course there's another lineage which one might call the Austrian lineage as opposed to the neoclassical lineage represented by people like Peter Bauer, who on policy conclusions coincided very much on the same general ideas, but came to them in a somewhat different way, not necessarily through ideas of the efficient allocation of resources on the margin, which were centered on neoclassical understandings, but rather on ideas concerning the failure of the state to do better than the market in a diversity of settings. So these two background intellectual lineages, I would say, played a considerable role in generating an increasing influence of mono-economics in the 1970s in particular. And they can be seen, I think, if one goes back and looks at the ideas of some of the economists who were gaining an influence in this period within the development institutions as being quite important and influential. I think of the 1970s as being important because prior to that, in the 1950s and 1960s, I think it's fair to say that the policy reform agenda of the major development institutions in Washington, in particular the World Bank and the IMF, was much less pronounced than it came to be subsequently. We know that the IMF in particular was charged explicitly with a stabilization function, in particular on the external front, and by and large in the 1950s it adopted a point of view which was relatively non-committal with respect to the most desirable policy framework within the country, within a given country. And as we all know, and I don't have to belabor this, the World Bank as well shifted toward policy lending only quite late in the day, and even through the 1970s was by and large involved in infrastructural lending and lending for projects, often on a grand scale, but without having very deep commitments with respect to policy. So what happened exactly? Well, I think in the background, these ideas were gaining force. The economics departments in the United States and the UK were certainly important in generating a certain prominence for the ideas of monoeconomics. Of course, the economics departments, by and large, represented the first of these, the two lineages I mentioned, namely the neoclassical economic lineage rather than the Austrian economic lineage. Now these ideas, although they were gaining an influence among economists and arguably among policy makers of certain kinds, at the meso level, as it were, within the development institutions, I think would not have had the worldwide impact that they did have was it not for two other historical phenomena or forces. One of them was, of course, the rise of Thatcherism and Reaganism and allied political phenomena in the developed world, which were more influenced perhaps by the Austrian than the neoclassical lineage, though both were important at the level of ideas, and represented a backlash against the state and Golden Age Keynesianism and the particular failures which were ascribed to it. In addition, of course, you have the particular conjunction of circumstances in the developing countries, which emerged in the late 1970s and more so in the early 1980s, with a growth slowdown in a number of countries, and again, to recite a story which will bore many of you because you know it well, an increase in world interest rates occasioned by particular coming together of factors, including the tight interest rate regime in the United States and the expansion of deficit-financed expenditures, the Reagan rearmament in the United States, high world oil prices, which had a very substantial impact on oil importing countries, and so forth. A particular conjunction of factors, what these days might be called a perfect storm, which in particular resulted in Latin America, but also in a number of other highly indebted countries, or major borrowers, I should rather say, which had borrowings from commercial banks, as well as from the from governments and the international financial institutions, to have difficulties in repayment, and that occasioned a necessity for major financing, which created, I would say, an opportunity. It's not immediately obvious, ex ante or ex post, that the resolution of the debt crisis had to have taken the particular form that it did, being accompanied by policy reforms which had the specific ideological character and content which they did. But I think that that the history unfolded as it in fact did because of the confluence of ideas and historical opportunities and necessities. So we have a range of historical circumstances which come together to create the era of policy reform. Of course, John Williamson doesn't coin the term Washington Consensus until 1988. And as he describes it in his essay on the history of the Washington Consensus, he introduces the concept as a way of trying to convince policymakers, congressmen in particular in the United States, but also elsewhere, that they ought to support Latin American debt relief. Why? Because Latin American countries are all agreed that they should do the things which Washington institutions and economists are agreed that they should do, namely the elements in the Washington Consensus. And given that they're being good and doing the particular things that are being prescribed to them, the necessary counterpart action on the part of the United States and other countries is to support debt forgiveness as a way of making these enabling these policies to succeed and as a reward for undertaking them. So We have the era of policy reform, we have the era of structural adjustment lending, no longer called that, of course, nowadays, but called that in that period. And we have the beginnings also of a reaction against adjustment with the human face. The landmark UNICEF volume is, I think, published in 1988, if I'm not wrong also. So it's a very, or maybe a little later. Is it?
Well,
Quite early on. So it's a very early statement, really, which coincides with, or it's almost coincident in time with, the coining of the term Washington Consensus by John Williamson. So you have the beginnings of a reaction, though I would say that the reaction is very much in the nature of an inchoate one. The reaction of which is exemplified by adjustment with the human face, which I think is really a landmark intellectual moment in the history of the United Nations, is one which I would say by and large emphasizes the problem of the social costs of adjustment. It engages in a diagnosis, an entirely appropriate one, that the social costs being generated by the adjustment process have largely been overlooked by those who have focused on the macroeconomic objectives of the adjustment process, and that this is not only generating devastation on the ground, which has an intrinsic significance and ought to be considered in and of itself, but it also has implications with respect to the long-term success of these programs. And here the argument, I think, becomes a little bit fuzzy, but of course it's there's a pointing to investment in children as being crucial for the long-term growth and development of the countries concerned. There are also elements of a macroeconomic critique suggesting that an alternative set of macroeconomic policies might have done better, or at least as well, without generating the same costs. But I would say, in retrospect, if we were to read Adjustment with the Human Face, perhaps that aspect of the argument is the least developed and, at that point, the least convincing. What can we say about how the Washington Consensus has been received subsequently? What has happened to the Washington Consensus as a set of ideas? Well, of course, almost as soon as John Williamson described the concept of the Washington Consensus, it became something that nobody wanted to be identified with. In particular, those whose ideas might have been described by the concept. So there was a very interesting way in which it immediately became an orphan concept. And of course, the concept of structural adjustment also very quickly became similarly radioactive. The institutions in question stopped describing their lending as adjustment lending, even if that's in fact basically what it was. They adopted a new language for understanding policy reforms and disavowed the idea of the Washington Consensus. Well, what replaces it? And what exactly is the intellectual understanding which emerges as a way to one of the primary ways in which a shift in the intellectual terrain takes place is that a group of people emerges who represent a vision which one might call Washington Consensus Plus or Washington Consensus Minus. The proponents of Washington Consensus Plus are those who espouse what are today called second and even third generation reforms. Ideas such as, for example, the importance of institutional development involving public sector reform, reform of the judiciary, reform of taxation and tax collection systems, or ideas such as that of investment in human capabilities as an essential component of a successful, more intermediate and long-term oriented growth and development process. Ideas which emphasize, in one way or another, the insufficiency of the original prescription, without necessarily commenting, without commenting in one way or another upon the content of the original prescription. Jeff Sachs's view, I would say, and the view of the Millennium Project is a good intellectual example of the Washington Consensus Plus position. Professor Sachs, with his collaborators, has adumbrated very clearly in various writings, for example, in his book, The End of Poverty, but also in, I think perhaps best in his Brookings paper on Sub-Saharan Africa's poverty trap, the sense in which it is his is a Washington consensus plus position, which is basically that he believes that countries are caught in poverty traps, macroeconomic poverty traps, as a result of a variety of conditions, many microeconomic in nature, some even non-economic in nature, at least in the on the surface. For example, epidemiological, geographical, or other poverty traps. And the task then of the economic diagnostician is to identify what is required in order for a country to overcome its initial poverty traps so that it can then take advantage of the Washington Consensus policies. I should tell you, and here I'm going to violate a confidence without really violating a confidence because I wasn't sworn to confidence, that years ago I happened to be at a lunch with John Williamson and Jeffrey Sachs in the Harvard Faculty Club. And I remember very distinctly an amazing conversation in which Jeff Sachs said to John Williamson that he believed that people should lift themselves up by their bootstraps, but that it was first necessary for them to have boots. This is a wonderful, I think, summary of the Washington Consensus Plus position in the Sachs variant. And of course, there are other variants of this position as well. So there's no disavowal of the formula of liberalization, stabilization, and privatization. But there is an insistence that for that formula to work, certain initial preconditions are required. And for those preconditions to be addressed requires some initial diagnostic work with respect to whether the problem is to do with institutions, with epidemiology, or something else, and appropriate correctives are needed. Those correctives may consist of a capital infusion, they may consist of other very specific interventions involving anti-malaria activity, and so on and so forth. The position of people like Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, who have recently been celebrated for their book called Poor Economics, a deliberate double entendre on their part. I thought it was not deliberate, but I realized when I read the first chapter that it was deliberate. I think can be put under the same heading, for the reason that they are altogether silent on the macroeconomic questions and the questions of policy at the level of national choice and determination, and believe, with Jeff Sachs, that the major concern is to free individuals and communities from the poverty traps which afflict them, where there are poverty traps which afflict them, through appropriately chosen interventions and policies. Policies targeted at that level. One way to describe this particular tendency within the Washington Consensus Plus view, which perhaps unfairly, but I think not entirely unfairly, is that it emphasizes a kind of pianissimo, a focus on the small, and is content to focus on the small, insisting that the larger story will work itself out if one only does that. That is something I think one cannot say about Jeff Sachs. What is the Washington Consensus minus view? Well, I think there are not many people who represent the Washington Consensus minus view. One version of the Washington Consensus minus view, without being, I think, too unfair, might be the Hernando de Soto view. In fact, John Williamson mentions in his essay on the history of the Washington Consensus that he was inspired to include the 10th point in his list of policy reforms on property rights by Hernando de Soto, whose book, The Other Path, had of course become prominent in the mid-1980s, just prior to John Williamson's enumeration of the 10 points. And Hernando de Soto's insistence that what he calls the mystery of capital is, or addressing the mystery of capital is by ensuring the proper promulgation and protection of property rights is not only necessary, but it seems sufficient to address the development ills of the age, might be understood as a Washington Consensus minus position. It's Washington Consensus minus because it includes some of the elements of the Washington Consensus, but not all. Another version of this, arguably, is the Easterly position. The Easterly position insists, and Paul Collier and others arguably also present a version of this, though I don't want to insist on that because there are variants. That the Washington Consensus policies would suffice if it were not for the impediment of aid or other props which generate the wrong incentives and thereby corrupt governmental institutions, causing policies which would otherwise succeed to fail. Now, this tendency, although I think it's been the most prominent discursive orientation in relation to the Washington Consensus, which is not to attack it, but to modify it, either by expanding it or in certain cases by contracting it, is, I think, the least interesting of the versions, of the responses. The more interesting response, and perhaps the one which has involved more thought, is that which insists that the Washington Consensus, as originally promulgated, contained the wrong medicine. And here, of course, Joseph Stiglitz is a very prominent example of someone who has taken that position, arguing in particular in relation to the East Asian crises of the late 1990s, but also crisis of the late 1990s, but also with respect to other cases, that the medicine which the IMF and to a lesser extent the World Bank, he does make that separation, I'm not sure I would, but he does very much make that separation, or that distinction. The medicine which it has historically used in particular crises, and all of you know the particular arguments that he makes, have been the counterproductive ones. That, for example, introducing a deliberately contractionary macroeconomic environment as a way of dealing with macroeconomic crises which are really centered on the fragility of the banking system and on the collapse of asset values is a poor and indeed very likely counterproductive way to deal with such crises. A different medicine is necessary, perhaps an exactly opposite medicine to that which prescribed, a loose monetary policy rather than a tight one, for example. Now, this line of thought, which insists on context-relevant and context-specific determination of appropriate policies, I would say prefigures in many ways the discussion which has emerged after the crash of 2008 in the developed countries. That what is today called macroprudential regulation, for instance, the idea that central banks should be concerned with the stability of the financial system and should be concerned with regulation as a matter of macroeconomic policy, and that this should not be something which is dealt with as an entirely separate and separable concern, and that more generally central banks should be concerned with asset prices and the stability of asset prices as a way of ensuring macroeconomic stability, is, I think, something which one can see progenitors of in the earlier discussion on developing country crises, and in particular in the criticisms made of the dominant approach to dealing with those crises by people like Joe Stiglitz. So what has happened today is that after the crisis in the developed countries on a grand scale, these ideas have become viewed as much more legitimate and much more central, to the extent that, as you know, Olivier Blanchard, for example, and his co-authors wrote a paper called Rethinking Macroeconomic Policy, an IMF paper, which contained exactly these prescriptions, which a decade earlier would have been very much out of court, arguably. Another related response, not incompatible, but generalizing this view, I would say, in a certain abstract direction, is that which Danny Roderick and his collaborators, such as Ricardo Hausmann, have presented. Insisting, to use the phrase that Danny Roderick uses, that there is one economics but many recipes. And in particular, that what is needed in order to bring about a successful development strategy is for individual countries to properly assess the specific constraints and bottlenecks which face them in the development process, and to address those constraints and bottlenecks which are most important to address. This determination is necessarily context-specific and will, in general, lead to a prescription which is at variance with the Washington Consensus, not only occasionally, but in general, on this view. I will come back to the question of whether one economics suffices, as Danny Roderick suggests, but I think that it is right to think of this as presenting a frontal critique of the Washington Consensus view, because of its insistence on an alternative theoretical frame, one in which the theory of the second best, long recognized by economists, is further generalized to present a picture of problem solving as the task of development, where problem solving involves the identification of bottlenecks and constraints to be addressed and relaxed through policy on a case-by-case basis. Now, what should we make of these criticisms and where they leave us? Do they present us with a way out of the inadequately narrow, or overly narrow, rather, prism of the Washington Consensus? Do they present us with a sufficient intellectual alternative? I would suggest that they do not, in three different respects. At least. There are more, I think, but in three different respects at least, which I would like to emphasize. The first concerns their understanding of politics. If one looks at the way in which reforms have been discussed in the last 25 years in the policy arena, I would say that by and large there has been a tendency to discuss reforms in terms of a very dichotomous understanding of the actors in the reform process, in particular as being either corrupt or virtuous. So you have a very schizophrenic view of the nature of the reform process, where we are told that there are old elites which have captured the state apparatus for their own ends, which use public, which employ the state and the public exchequer primarily toward their particular, to service their particular interests, and which more generally engage in systematic activities of rent seeking. Into this morass enter the virtuous reformers. The virtuous reformers are usually technocrats, sometimes legitimated or emboldened by democratic mandate in one sense or another. But the virtuous reformers enter into this situation and they break up, like Jesus entering the temple and ridding it of the moneylenders. They break up all of these monopolies which exist. Now, I think that this view, this Manichaean or dichotomous view of the nature of politics in the reform process has been extremely costly and damaging. There are many examples that one can provide, but I think it's sufficient to look at examples in which privatizations in particular have gone terribly wrong in the former Soviet Union and elsewhere, to see that being pro-business, and in particular in favor of the creation of a business class, perhaps a new business class, at variance with the old one, is not the same thing as being pro-market. Creating a market with condition, which involves impartial adjudication between different economic interests, requires a very particular kind of social and political consensus to enable the organs of state to function in such a way that they can deliver impartial and arm's length treatment. And of course, there's no society or economy in the world in which that ideal is met. But it is analytically important to distinguish between the conditions of creating a certain set of business interests and fueling the interests of a business elite, which are of course very contextually specific from country to country, and those which are involved in generating something approximating a competitive market economy, even if that is one's goal. But further, a reason that it is so difficult to construct a competitive market economy, and indeed to maintain it as a stable entity, is that there are always pressures in one way or another to corrupt and reconfigure the institutions which govern a competitive market economy. This is the general rule, not the specific one. So the problem of crony capitalism, in short, is not only one which is specific to Indonesia in the mid-1990s or other such cases. It's a general problem that capitalists will seek to become cronies of political actors and will seek in one way or another to influence the political process in a way which furthers their interests, before and after the so-called reforms. It's not the case that there was an old order which was bad and there will be a new order which is good, in which the technocrats establish the right rules, which they then provide a sufficient framework for economic activity in all time to come. But rather, the institutions have to be designed in an ongoing way to manage the fact that actors in an economy and in a society have diverse and often mixed interests, and will seek to further their private interests in many instances through influencing the public process. But this is not the same thing as accepting the view that that's all that exists either. There can be such a thing as publicly oriented policies, and there can be such a thing as activity which is not entirely corrupted by rent-seeking and privatism. And recognizing the simultaneity of these motivations before and after the reform process is essential to understanding the politics of the reform process. There are various, again, specific examples that that one can provide of how an alternative understanding of these politics would matter to our understanding of what is desirable, but I will leave that for now due to lack of time. The second idea which I would like to present as being crucial to an alternative view is that which insists that our task should not merely be to identify what are the right policies from some existing menu of policies, but to redefine what that menu is through a process of intellectual plasticity and institutional experimentation. There are many examples that one can provide as to why that's important. Let me give you just one. For many, many years, as you all know, it was thought that it was not possible to pursue export promotion in a regime which also was characterized by import substitution. But the successful East Asian late developing economies have shown us that not only is it possible, arguably was even necessary in their particular historical circumstances to do so, at least to achieve the particular growth path which they did achieve. So a conceptual distinction was made through a particular empirical experiment, historical experiment, which cannot be ignored. And that conceptual distinction has entered our repertoire of concepts in a way which enables us to think more freely and more interestingly about what is possible. Here I think there's much, much more work to be done. Both the neoclassical and the more broadly neoliberal and Austrian-influenced views on economic policy are very much captured by a static efficiency concern. Their most powerful arguments have to do with the way in which particular kinds of governmental policies or interventions distort the allocation of resources statically. But the process of growth and development does not begin to be adequately characterized by that static efficiency concern. And on the broader question of what generates a dynamic pathway of growth and development in a country, they have very little to say. So, for example, neoclassical trade theory, which is a very impressive intellectual domain in certain ways, is almost entirely about the static efficiency concern. What it has to say about growth at the theoretical level is extremely limited. And what it has to say about it empirically through cross-country growth regressions and other empirical examinations of the question is subject to various criticisms. So, in particular concerning the robustness of the conclusions drawn to possible variations in specifications and the like. So, we have an intellectual framework which is quite inadequate to the task of understanding the process of growth and development. Development understood, as Schumpeter told us, in terms of structural transformation, and growth understood in terms of the long-run process of economic transformation. by and large, the whole intellectual armamentarium which we have is inadequate to understanding the processes of growth and development, impressive as it is in helping us understand efficiency and static allocation. And this underlines to me the need for the invention of new concepts. The work of someone like Ha-Joon Chang and others, which tells us about the historical character of the process of growth and development, is important. But I think we cannot become prisoners of our history. We need to have more subtle ways of thinking. And this is where I would disagree respectfully with my teacher, Danny Roderick. I don't agree that there is only one economics, which involves the characterization of economies and societies in terms of the interactions of maximizing agents, all of whom have interests and face constraints. I think that that's a way you can describe any social process, but it's not always the most illuminating way. I could, and you could, if you wish, describe this room in terms of the activities of a set of maximizing agents, each of whom faces their particular constraints. There would be a way of describing why you are not individually choosing to leave at this particular moment and why you're choosing to stay here in terms of such a description. But I'm not sure that it would be the most effective or illuminating description. And here I think we really need to explore new concepts which are related to institutional alternatives. The work of Roberto Unger in this regard, which Danny Roderick has been influenced by in the background, I think provides a much more compelling way of understanding the problem. Finally, and let me end on this point, I think that all of the discussion relating to the Washington Consensus has been much too narrow in that it has focused on national development policies. Even the heterodox and critical discussion about the Washington Consensus has focused on the question of what should be the alternative national development policies. Whereas increasingly what we are seeing is that we are living in a context in which it is not possible to consider those national development policies in isolation from various points of view. And there are two examples or two dimensions of this which stand out in my mind at this moment, and of course there are others, and the United Nations is very much relevant here in bringing this understanding to the development problem. One of them is, of course, the consequences of pursuing an austerity-oriented pathway in the world economy. The spillovers of national economic policies focusing on austerity, leading ultimately to a crisis in aggregate demand globally, and the consequences, I would say, also of pursuing a set of policies which lead not only to a generalized diminishment of aggregate demand, but also to the dampening of wages globally, social wages as well as monetary wages, and a policy orientation which is biased against workers rather than for workers, is having and will continue to have very damaging consequences. And the only way to understand the need for an alternative orientation, which involves a bias toward inclusion and toward higher wages, economic and social, is, I think, to put this choice in its proper international and global context. For example, and this is only one of many such interdependencies, the problem of Chinese surpluses cannot be addressed, and of imbalances in the global economy relating to Chinese surpluses and more generally surpluses of export-oriented economies, cannot be addressed without thinking about ways in which the wages of workers in those economies can be increased, preferably in a coordinated fashion, so as to mitigate the impact on export competitiveness and on development opportunities and potential. A second, and here I will really end, final aspect of this is, of course, the ecological problem and the problem of climate change. We know that the length of time which the world has to deal with the problem of climate change before, or it appears by all indications that the length of time we have to deal with it before there is irretrievable harm to basic life support systems is not very long. And the sheer poverty of the way in which the growth and development process has been discussed and continues to be discussed in terms of expansion of material production and consumption without regard for, or it seems in a completely dichotomous way from, the question of how to deal with climate change, I think has become an increasing embarrassment. And here again I would suggest that what we need to do in thinking about national development strategies is to integrate them much more profoundly into our understanding of global interdependency. Asking the question, for instance, what would it mean to develop a global trade regime and a global economic system which created room for development and development orientation, in particular for poor countries, while diminishing the dependence of the rich countries on continued growth in order to reduce unemployment and to achieve their own social and economic goals. We live today in a situation where zero growth in the developed countries is a crisis. And it's a crisis because zero growth in the developed countries, even low growth in the developed countries, means rising unemployment in the developed countries. And because livelihoods and dignity of human beings and citizens are deeply integrated with employment. So we have economies which are structured and oriented in such a way that it is inconceivable that we could really shift toward a lower growth regime without creating enormous social harm. So we need to have a systemic rethinking in order to address that problem. Let me, in this connection, cite something which I read by Gilbert Rist, or is it Gilbert Rist, the historian of development, in the second edition of his very interesting book on the history of development, in which he has a very harsh critique of the MDGs as leading to an overly balkanized understanding of the development process. In fact, his discussion of the MDGs is under a heading called Development in Shreds. And the reason he uses that phrase is that he wants to argue, I think, that development is only a useful concept if it enables us to think systemically about the relevant interconnections. But as soon as we insist that we must think about individual goals in abstraction from those interconnections, then we are doomed to miss all of the important questions and the real answers. Let me stop there. Thank you so much.
Before that, I think it was very useful. Maybe in the discussion we can take on some of these issues in order as you raise them. Maybe discussion of the origins of the Washington Consensus. The title of your talk was After the Washington Consensus. One could ask oneself, are we already in the stage of after, or are we still in the middle of it? Or should we, is the Washington Consensus shifted location? Because if it was the case that the Washington-based institutions were propagating what is the core of the Washington Consensus, of course what we now getting from Europe, we may be more willing to speak of Brussels or Berlin consensus of a combination of fiscal austerity when the economy is down, and talking about structural reforms to hoping to resolve those problems. So I think the shades are falling over Europe, with the IMF even saying that maybe the fiscal austerity is a bad idea to begin with. So maybe something has shifted over time. May also something would be interesting to pass by is, well, what's the Washington Plus and where's the Washington Minus stand? So having lived and worked myself in the early 90s in Washington, D.C., already at that time, we basically were in the middle of the Washington Plus, what you call the Washington Plus, not just beyond the macroeconomic adjustment or the structural adjustment, as it's called then, but the broader economic reforms, but also social sector reforms. So the big talk then was institutional reform, but also how to make social service delivery more efficient, meaning also market reforms introduced within the social sector business. So maybe as we seem to be placing that a little bit more when you talked about the Millennium Project, that's something that coined the Washington Consensus Plus, but maybe didn't mean that. But actually, there was already more than a decade before when that was ongoing. maybe the interesting thing is, well, where do we stand now in terms of the Washington Consensus, and how has that evolved into both things that we may not like and things we may think are necessary. There's a lot of the discussion also, it's not just about freeing up markets, but also discussion moved into the direction of, well, how specifically should one organize better market systems that they work better and more properly for the benefit of development. Then I guess you sketched, and that's the second part. We may want to have some discussions, sort of challenges for the new agenda or new thinking moving forward. I think you said a number of interesting things there, so understanding well the politics that's underlying the economics. But there maybe also sort of you refer to crony capitalism as it became to be mentioned as part of the post-Asian crisis, which always struck me as very interesting, is how perceptions also change. It's like the crony capitalism, a lot of them refer to that as what the chaebols did in Korea, which of course in the 1950s and 1960s, 1970s was seen to be the ideal kind of public-private partnership that you could have. And you only need one person to point it as crony capitalism, and of course that's bad. But maybe, of course, these things evolve over time. Maybe over time it becomes from a good relationship into something bad. So maybe talk about benign cancer becoming a bad cancer. We also emphasize the idea of growth and development as structural transformation. I think that's very important. That's also the kind of approach we take here. But my education doesn't happen to too many countries, but you could specialize in my country in development economics, actually. I was trained in development economics. Of course, that was all about structural transformation, and up to the 1970s, the main paradigm was development as structural change. Hollis Chenerys of this world, but also the founding fathers of development emphasized that very much. So it's very important also to discuss what we keep from that and what you see as important changes away from that. Then finally, and I'll stop there and then give it area for discussion. I think your final point, important point of embedding national development strategies into the global context and global challenges may indeed need to give for a different view of how national development strategies have to be conceived, not just of the current challenges, but maybe also because of misunderstandings of the past, right? Like the import substitution model by many was seen as a sort of an inward-looking strategy, although the godfather of that strategy, or these people see it as the godfather of that strategy, people like Raoul Prebisch. If you read the original propositions, it was import substitution to diversify and to promote exports, and not something as just to promote national development. But then many people don't read the original documents, but just read from hearsay. But I think that just leaves into place the importance of looking at international repercussions and how to adapt national development strategies in a context where the world has been increasingly globalized, and it's not a simple way of just making your own policy choices without looking at what happens elsewhere. Right, so maybe we can try some broad strand of discussion. Maybe just invite the first set of comments, maybe on focusing on the history of the Washington Consensus and where we stand now, and then we can move in the second round to discussion. So what should be, or what could be the after Washington Berlin Consensus. Let's start at this side and we move to that side. So Alex as well. I have two Alexes there. 1, 2, and then 1 here.
Very quickly, very nice presentation. But just to be a bit picky, I think there is a certain gap in the way in which you develop the argument, and I must take the whole of it, not the 2 bits as Rob was suggesting. it seems at the beginning that you are talking about something that has to do with development, but then the major two crucial innovations or propositions that are shown as an alternative, they actually had little to do with Washington Consensus, had more to do with the basics of understanding macroeconomic policies in and of itself. You pick up Keynes and then you realize that you cannot really propose austerity policies, a confluence of austerity policies for the world as a whole, because that also leads to a vicious circle of downward spiral of aggregate demand. You take, for example, the other proposition, environmental friendly type of development that should look at the long-term possibilities for expansion and growth, considering the constraints in the world, had little to do with Washington Consensus in the concept of development economics as such. It has to do more with the understanding of long-term development and constraints. So I think that there is certain kind of work that you have to do in order to bring these new ideas in the context of the broader underpinnings of the Washington Consensus, which are much earlier than Williamson. Just pick up Pollard, for example, the monetary approach to the balance of payments, and we can go on like that. So that's one thing that I noticed. There is a certain gap in how to merge the two parts of the argument, which I find that could perhaps be worked out a bit more. And the other thing that is somehow related with that is that if you take that strand, that it is a kind of underlying understandings of macroeconomic policies before and underneath the Washington Consensus, to which you come up with alternatives, then perhaps, just to be picky, perhaps we don't need to find many new ideas. I would actually rescue a bit of Keynes, a bit of Minsky, a bit of Kaldor, and I have all what I need in order to start to try to repair the kind of policy mindset of the world of today.
Two questions. Thanks, Sanjay. One is I want to push you on the alternatives. I think you didn't have time to expose the historical part. One is that what politics means in the new framework that you are trying to present. What is the linkages with macroeconomics? Politics could be also taking as the Washington Consensus emphasis on institutions, independent rich institutions. That's one question. The second question is, it seems that we have to be careful when we shift attention from, you say, from the national development strategies to the international coordination, etc. Because we also have the other argument that says we have the, the international emphasis, but then we didn't pay enough attention to national development strategy. For example, the ILO, there is one ILO argument, that they did so good in establishing programs and the social base, etc. But at the same time, they say, yes, but at the national level, we have to do more. So what is the instrument or the argument that you could present that, well, it's not a question of shifting from one to the other emphasis, it's just actually both are contained, and I wanted a kind of more elaboration.
Thank you. So much for my efforts to try to separate discussion, but I'll just allow you to ask oppositions.
Yeah, no, I think Rob's correct that your presentation can be divided into two. We could confine our comments to any of those. But I think rather than looking at intellectual history, etc., which I think you provide a very excellent account here, it may be more useful to focus on the future and the ideas that you just mentioned in that regard. And I think your presentation comes at a very opportune moment for us here, because we are just trying to think about our next West issue, focused on post-2015 development agenda, etc., etc. So in that regard, looking forward is probably very practically useful. Now, in that regard, I, of course, fully share your idea that, I think increasingly it is dawning to everybody who are observing, is that there is some fundamental rethinking is necessary in view of the urgency of climate change and other, that's one thing. The other is, and the second is also in view of the difficulty of sustaining employment in developed capitalist countries. And in that regard, rather than just pointing to these necessities, I think it is probably time to go a little forward. And we here at GPAG, particularly GSP, while we were working on 2010 West, we had to kind of confront this issue. And actually, that process led us to some familiarity with the work done at New Economic Foundation in England. Tim Jackson and his colleagues, who have, I think, gone a little farther than where you have just left it today. So, in particular, Jackson, in his paper, he tried to propose a new macroeconomic model where he could delink employment from growth. And obviously, we know that, given this climate crisis, the further increase in material growth in developed countries is probably not a very sound proposition. But we need employment, and so how these two goals can reconcile. But my review of that model, rudimentary model, whatever is suggested in that paper, left me unsatisfied, and I don't think that that kind of can be satisfactory to economics profession broadly. So my question to you is, how familiar you are with that line of work, which is, which basically picks up from where you have left it here, and whether you have been thinking a little bit more about this practical task, because unless we can produce a sound theory where you can show that employment can be delinked from growth, which can simultaneously solve these two twin problems, unemployment and climate crisis, etc., I don't think practical policy formulation can receive much momentum. So that's where I think the focus and effort should be, and I would like to know a little bit more about what your personal effort or contribution is there in that regard.
Shall we take one more, Sanjay? Or you? Sure. Yeah? And then I'll move to that side of the Vladimir.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Sanjay. My question actually is related to the point that was raised by Rob, and it's an elaboration on this point about chaebols. Why chaebols were considered to be important policy innovation 30 years ago, and today they are characterized as crony capitalism. And to generalize, one can ask a question, what is the driving force behind the change in concepts in development thinking that we see? And I'll offer you several options, several ways to answer the question, and maybe you can elaborate on that. Right? One way would be to say that, like in physics, we're getting smarter and smarter. There is a theory, then research leads to revelation of the factors that don't fit into the theory. Then there is a new theory that embraces all these facts that don't fit into the theory. So we move to a more general and general theory. And to say no would be to offend many economists, right? Because we like to think that we're getting smarter and we understand more. The second option would be, there is a pendulum, right? We go from impulse substitution and big push. When we're bored with this kind of concepts and we see they don't work, we go to privatization and deregulation. And then we go to post-Washington consensus, and then we go to something else, right? The third option would be, everything depends on the combination of interests. Developing countries versus developed countries, workers versus bourgeoisie, right? Whoever is stronger at this particular moment, those theories become dominant. And finally, the fourth version would be that it is linked to reality, what happens to in reality. Well, for instance, it may be pointed out, it was pointed out more than once, that the rise of the Washington Consensus was a response to the debt crisis in Latin America, right, and in Africa in the beginning of 1980s. And the rise of post-Washington Consensus was a response to the collapse of those ideas in the former Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, in Sub-Saharan Africa, right? So the problem with this one would be that there is no such thing as Beijing Consensus. There is a term, Beijing Consensus, which was coined by Joshua Rama, but it is about different things. You would think that the economic miracles should have some theory behind them. But in fact, these miracles, economic miracles, emerged as the experimentation of strong-hand politicians like Lee Kuan Yew. And it seems like, there is, the development economists cannot take credit, as I usually say, for economic miracles. They can take credit for the failures of impulse substitution, of Washington Consensus. They don't like to do it. But they cannot take credit for the cases of economic miracles. Thank you.
All right, that gives you enough ammunition, I guess.
Very difficult questions. I don't think I can do any of them justice. maybe I could perhaps put together the two questions on the ends, because I think that they're in comments. There is a tie there between Vladimir's and Rob's concerns. Where do we stand in terms of the Washington Consensus, you asked, Rob? And Vladimir asked, how do we understand how our ideas change over time? I think that if we look in more detail than I was able to go into in my presentation about how the idea of second and third generation reforms emerged, of course, it had everything to do with the apparent failure of the Washington Consensus. If you look at all the detailed empirical studies of the Washington Consensus, certainly in the first 10 to 15 years done by people like Tony Killick or many others, what you will find is that basically the Washington Consensus policies, structural adjustment policies, were reasonably good at achieving their short-term stabilization objectives. But they were not very good at generating long-term or medium or long-term growth objectives. And in some places, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, they were absolutely disastrous, leading to contraction, not the resumption of growth, but leading to contraction. And of course, this led those involved to ask the question, what are we missing? Now, it's rather unfortunate that one has to experiment on human populations with tremendous social costs involved in order to learn elementary things, such as that institutions matter, or that it might not be a good thing to decimate the university system in a country, and put it just because primary education is also important. Now, some of these things could have been thought of in advance if one had bothered to think about them in advance, but people didn't bother. So I think there's certainly a dialectic which was involved between what happened on the ground, so to speak, and what was learned and what was and how concepts were revised. But I think it was much too costly. It's not that there weren't people who were warning. It's not that there wasn't the possibility of thinking some of these thoughts. So I think we cannot escape the ideological connection, or the role of ideology and the role of interests in determining what is seen and what is not seen. Now we have learned that institutions matter, the rule of law matters, the judiciary matters, higher education matters, people have diseases or they make them unproductive, and so on and so forth. We've learned various things. Good. After 15 years. And the second and the third generation reforms respond to all these thoughts. I'm not sure that it's a very impressive record. What does social science have to offer? Well, I'm not sure it has very much to offer. I think that part of the problem here has been the overselling of social science, and in particular the overselling of economics and what economics have to offer. This is a disaster generated by economics in a number of countries, generated by the excessive prestige which was accorded to a certain way of understanding economic principles. And that's one of the reasons I think that I wanted to bring to develop this discussion in terms of the history of ideas, and in particular in terms of the role of neoclassical and neoliberal ideas more generally. And when I say it doesn't have much to offer, I mean social science is presently constituted. What do we need to do? Well, I think that we have to do a lot of learning from experiment and from practice. It works in practice. Does it work in theory? This is a lot of the time the question which social scientists ask, and unfortunately it's one of the questions we have to ask. There has to be some role of theory, but that role should not be oversold. I think this is where Danny Roderick and company are completely right. That the problem of development strategy and policy making is a problem of policy making. Excuse me, I meant to say the problem of development strategy is a problem of problem solving. And that task of problem solving is a pragmatic task which has to be undertaken in context. I think where they're a little bit weaker is in the rather technocratic approach which they take to understanding how that process can take place. Whereas in fact it has to be embedded in society and politics in a more profound way. On the question, Alex, regarding Alex 1, regarding whether Keynes, Minsky, and Kaldor suffice, I'm not sure. For much the same reason that I just responded to the other question. Did Jacques Pollock already have the Washington consensus in his model? I don't think so. I mean, that was a model of macroeconomic stabilization, and the contractionary orientation is there clearly, and the IMF IMF policymaking from the first has had a contractionary orientation because of the focus on the responsibility of deficit countries to eradicate deficits, without attention to any of to the role of surplus countries. But I think the increasing content given to the idea of desirable policies over time, and in particular in the 1970s and 80s, late 1970s and 1980s, is really the important historical shift here. All we need is a concern with Keynesian macroeconomics and ecology. No, I'm not saying that. I think what I really want to emphasize is that the problem of development strategy, especially in its dynamic aspects, is fundamentally unsolved. We don't understand very much about what makes economies dynamic. What we think we understand is generally wrong. And let me give you one other example of that. Look at something like the open source movement, an extraordinarily dynamic economic force. It's not just a social innovation, it's a dynamic economic force in the world economy. If Microsoft is brought to heel, in 10 years' time it will be because of open source innovation. So how do we understand this process? I don't think neoclassical economists even begin to have the tools. No economists begin to have the tools to understand this process. We don't understand innovation in large sectors of the contemporary world economy. And so I have to say that the task for developing countries is to find what works by way of creating national innovation-oriented systems. I doubt that economics as presently constituted has very much to say about that. What about the role of politics in response to Alex 2 and the connection to macroeconomics? Well, one example that I might give, Fahad here is working on this issue of public finance, political economy of public finance, is the following. The way in which economists generally think about taxation is in terms of an accounting problem. And they think about fiscal deficits in particular as an accounting problem. Well, fiscal deficits are not an accounting problem. They are manifestations of failures in the political economy. Fiscal deficits, especially large and chronic fiscal deficits, arise because there are demands from large sections of the society who treat the state public exchequer as a common property resource of a kind, which the state is not able or willing to resist. And the state, in turn, is weak in its capacity to generate resources, in particular through taxation, from the society. So it's a manifestation of the weakness of the state vis-a-vis the society. So when you have large and chronic fiscal deficits, it is because you have a fundamental political failure and, in a sense, a cultural failure in the relation between state and society. Now, how can one, therefore, address the problem? It's not going to be simply through a set of technical renovations, such as introducing a value-added tax or changing the way in which customs revenues are collected. That may help. But fundamentally, one needs, if you will, a Weberian and not merely a neoclassical economic approach to the problem, to understand how it is that this relationship can be transformed. This is a political and sociological question. So there are a number of examples of this kind, but this, I think, is one which suffices. Nasrul, you've asked an excellent question regarding employment. I'm not very familiar with what the New Economics Foundation has done on this, though I would like to see what they have done. I think this is the great, maybe perhaps unsolved problem. What role does job sharing of the kind which was implemented for a time, or to a degree in France, and limitations of work hours have to play? What role do other kinds of shifts, including cultural shifts, which could be encouraged by public policy, have to play? I think that I do not have a pat answer for you, but I think that this is precisely precisely the problem. So let me stop.
Thank you. Okay, now I'm going to look at this side of the room. So you may start at the back.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Reddy, for interesting talk. You briefly mentioned the East Asian model, and related to that, I have two questions. One is how do you relate the East Asian model, Washington Consensus, and the East Asian crisis? That's the first one. And second one is, can we revive or resurrect the East Asian model as a post-Washington Consensus for developing the development of the poor countries?
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank Sanjay for a very good presentation. One of the things that I think that the Washington Consensus brought is the dominance of the pro-market policy. And some people said that every time that there is a crisis, there is a change. For example, in the Great Depression, then they changed to the Keynesianism. Friedman saying that it wasn't literally, but he said that we are all Keynesians now in the 1950s. And then the extraflation came, and then they switched to the neoliberal policies. Then the end of the Soviet Union emphasized more the free market. And now this crisis that just came in 2008, does that change anything about the dominance of the policy of the free market and the idea that the only way to grow is with laissez-faire, and that if we don't integrate the private sector, that's the only solution in the policy making, and there is no option. The other option is the other extreme, that is the Soviet Union. There is nothing in the middle. I want to that you comment on the relationship between the crisis and the public policy dominance of these days.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for a very good presentation, Sanjay. I have a question and somewhat mixed with comments, and that is, to what extent do you plan to address the perpetual foreign currency constraints that very small open economies face? And I think that both growth policies and stabilization policies would be dependent on this constraint, because there are several of these economies that they basically import what they consume, a large percent, and export what they produce. So in an economy like that, your monetary policy would need to be structured very differently. Should we have a fixed exchange rate economy, as the governor of the Central Bank of Barbados will always argue that fixed exchange rate regime is a better regime. So my question basically is, to what extent are you going to think and include ideas along this line? Because I think the discussion somewhat exclude very small open economies. And I think that even if you look at very small open economies, you might see features that may be applicable to even larger ones like Greece. So that's basically.
Thank you. Sharon?
So Sanjay, thank you first of all for coming, and thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. As Nazrul and Rob have said, we are thinking about some of these issues, and in particular, this issue of national development strategies in the context of an integrated world. And two pieces of this: one is, how do small countries, what are the rules for small countries versus larger countries? And the second is sort of the conflict between your point number one on politics, which you talked about as crony capitalism in a national setting, but becomes an even bigger issue in some sense in an international setting, where national interests, we don't call them crony capitalism, but national interests become and so to the extent that how do you get the international agreements when you have national interests and so how do you bring these two things together? Point one and point three of your.
Okay. Two more over here.
Thank you, Mr. Sanjay. At the heart of alternative orientations that you taught, I believe, is public discussion. And this certainly brings a very challenging question, but I think that demands attention. That is, in what ways we can influence the quantity and quality of public discussion. This is even more challenging now because, as you rightly mentioned, this is also made now globally, not only locally. And the fact of the matter seems that locally we have very inefficient public discussions. And in an age in which we need not only locally public discussion, but also global public discussion. So I'd like to know what you think about that challenge.
Sanjay, a really wonderful talk. My question is a very simple and short one. The impression, and this follows up on Rob's comment earlier, the impression one hears in your presentation is of a certain consonance, a coherence, which seems to imply that the Washington consensus remains regnant, remains prominent in different ways. Is that an accurate perception on my part? For instance, would you say there is no dissonance whatsoever within development thinking? In this context, some would argue rights-based development is a sharp challenge to the Washington consensus. Now, you hinted at one point when you mentioned capabilities that could be seen as Washington consensus plus. Certainly, Sen's book's title, Development as Freedom, seems to have a nod towards some of the concerns of freedom that some of the Austrian economists had, for instance. But I'm curious, I'd like to sort of pin you on this. I'm curious where you'd place yourself on this. For instance, with the rights-based development would be seen by you as an amelioration of the Washington consensus, or are there alternatives at the moment which you can see as maybe an abrupt challenge to the Washington consensus?
All right. Questions have become easier, right?
Let me not answer that question. But at least for diplomatic reasons. Thank you, Rob. Well, I think a number of fantastic questions again. On the question regarding the East Asian model and its continued relevance. Well, of course, it's tremendously relevant. I mean, until the current, most recent phase of the emergence of new growth poles, in particular in India, China, and Brazil, and to a lesser extent in certain other countries, I would say that the East Asian development experience was the only development experience, the only experience of late developers in the 20th century, second half of the 20th century, escaping from the periphery to near the core of the world economy. So there was everything to learn from this experience, and despite the efforts of the World Bank and its East Asian Miracle Study and others to argue that these countries would have done still better if they had pursued some other set of policies, which seems extremely implausible since they were the fastest growing economies known until that point in history, I think it's abundantly clear that they came up with their own solutions, which didn't fit into until then conceived of development paradigms, and that one had to make sense of that. Now, there have been endless number of papers written about what South Asia, let's say, can learn from the East Asian experience and how it can incorporate it. And of course, the big question which always arises there is that of institutions, and of course also relatedly of state-society relations. So we see that from the very beginning, this is a political and social question. And I would say the more sophisticated, privatist, market-oriented, neoliberal, if you will, economists have tended to emphasize that. They, while conceding that there may have been certain ways in which the East Asian countries successfully climbed up the ladder through a conscious application of public policy, they would question the transferability of that lesson. Well, to my mind, this is a question mark, and a question mark which remains open more than it is anything else. And I think that the Chinese experience, in particular, raises still additional questions about the ways in which one can, in fact, violate the original Washington Consensus prescription of John Williamson and still do rather well. If one goes through the 10 points in Williamson's original prescription, I think it's fairly clear that the Chinese economy has partially fulfilled a very small number of the prescriptions and largely paid no attention to the rest. So the primary conclusion that we have is that our a priori understandings of development don't seem to make much sense in light of the actual development experience which we have. But this is not an answer. It's just a reiteration of your question. Jose, does the crisis of 2008 change our policy understanding? Yes, it changes it in various ways. I think, I don't have very much that will surprise you to say. I think the foremost thing which it tells us when the dust has cleared is that highly financialized economies are fragile. And we did not realize how financialized the major economies had become. And we did not realize that in part because of financial engineering, which had generated obscurantism to a shocking degree. So that when the crisis hit, as Shari knows and others very well, the major actors did not know what their net assets and liabilities were, and it took months for them to begin to figure that out. It's a shocking state of affairs, unprecedented, because of the amount of obscurantism, the sheer smokiness or cloudiness of the situation, which was an advanced stage of financialization. It was not merely that financialization, that the financial sector had become more and more important, but that the financial lenses through which they viewed the world had become obscure even to them, and thereby generated considerable confusion. And what we have seen is that the consequences in terms of macroeconomic instability are tremendous. This is again reiterated the necessity to not separate the macroeconomic from the microeconomic, in particular in understanding the appropriate framework for regulation and development of the financial sector and its relationship to the real economy. And of course, subtending this is the question of inequalities, as we all know, rising inequalities related to financialization and the neglect of the real economy in various countries, which has various equal distribution and other consequences. Tarun, on foreign exchange constraints and small economies, small open economies, you raise an incredibly important question. One of the things which Williamson comments on in his later screeds about the Washington Consensus is how the fashion or the fad has shifted with respect to exchange rate regimes. That at one point, as you know, there was a very live debate about exchange rate regimes. Then there was a kind of pseudo-consensus which emerged in favor of the so-called corner solutions, that you should either have fixed exchange rate, preferably with a hard peg or a currency board or some such thing, and or you should have a completely flexible exchange rate. And now we have another flip-flop, where the people who believe that are out of court, and the only sensible solution seems to be that one should have some version of managed float. At least that's what many in this discussion now believe. What does this show us? Well, I'm certainly more sympathetic to this current view than to the earlier view, if I have to choose between these two views. But I think what it shows us also is how damaging economic ideas can be if they're unmoored. We know the cost for various countries that pursued one or the other of these corner solutions without sufficiently interpreting or understanding the conditions required for their success and indeed what could bring about their failure. The current slow motion unfolding of the Eurozone crisis is another example of that, of course. It's amazing to think about how little public discussion, to bring the issue back to public discussion, there was about, or Pedro, you asked this, there was about the creation of the euro. You may remember the discussion on the creation of the euro. It was trumpeted as a political project. But how much discussion was there, either about the economic objectives or about and rationale, or about the conditions under which the project would succeed or fail? I would submit that if one went back and did a proper study of the public discussion which took place, one would find that precious little did in fact take place. And this is directly responsible for the current crisis situation which European countries, Eurozone countries, find themselves in. So public discussion is absolutely essential. But this again touches on the question of politics and reform. You know, there's a whole discussion of politics and reform which took place, especially in the heyday of structural adjustment and soon after, late 80s, early 90s. The World Bank published a number of volumes done by political scientists, people like Stefan Haggard and others, on the question of the politics of reform. And I would say, by and large, the motivation was very cynical. It was to ask the question, how do we get countries and populations to swallow the bitter pill of adjustment? And the answer that was given was often, well, we could create a social fund or some other mechanism which will put a nice gloss on the reforms and maybe provide a payoff to some of those who are opposed, and that will let us get the bitter pill down. Now that has very little to do with public discussion. But I think the truth about politics and reform, and of course reform is a highly loaded word here, what we really mean is the pro-market, pro-private property reforms of the period, market understood in a very narrow stereotyped way as well. The truth is that there is no mechanical or direct link between democratic politics understood at some high level of abstraction and the success or failure of such reforms, or the willingness to adopt or not such reforms. So you have a number of countries, especially in Latin America, which was undergoing a phase of democratization in the 80s and 90s. A number of countries where democratic regimes embrace reforms of this type, democratic governance. So a mechanical understanding of what that relationship is, I think, will not work at a high level of abstraction. On the other hand, if you ask the question, what was really the content of the discussion? How much genuine effort was there within the society to interpret and understand what was taking place? You might come up with the answer, not enough, even in the democratic regimes in question, or societies in question. Shari, small versus large countries. This is a very important, and national and international interests. This is a very important question. I think one has to think very hard about the tactics, strategy and tactics. There's a very interesting economic literature which has emerged in recent years on some of this. For example, well, one of the people who comes to mind is a guy named Giovanni Maggi at Princeton, who's done some interesting work on the question of incentives that countries face to enter agreements or not in specific issue areas, and whether there can be benefit to linking issue areas in order to bring about agreements so that you can give countries what they want in one area in order to get them to give up something in another area, thereby to bring about a stable agreement. Obviously, in climate change, this has been happening in different ways, and for a long time, the idea of a development exception or special prerogatives for developing countries, I think, has been a part of the negotiations framework to enable that to be the case. So I think there is no general rule that I could really draw attention to, but I think we can think more systematically about the dynamics of international negotiations, and there is an interesting literature emerging with respect to that. Finally, Nidhi, the rights-based approach to development and whether the Washington Consensus is still regnant. Again, a fantastic question. My view is that, in some sense, the Washington Consensus is not exactly regnant, but it provides, it has fragmented, and it forms the dominant common sense, unconscious common sense. It's a kind of doxa. It's something which we refer to without knowing why we refer to it often as providing the obvious answer. And I think this is very obvious. This is very clear in the current European debate, which is so dominated by an austerity orientation. And of course, that reflects certain interests, going back to Vladimir's question. But it also reflects the role of a certain way of understanding the world, which has deep historical origins, as I'm suggesting, but also has more proximate ones. Now, I did refer to capabilities in talking about investment in education and health and so on, but I suppose I should be careful that I'm not suggesting that Sen is necessarily to be, in the Senian worldview, is to be identified with second-generation reforms, though I think there is an interesting discursive question here. I think most of those involved would have seen what they were doing in terms of so-called second-generation reforms in these areas is involving investment in human capital, not capabilities. So they take a very productivist orientation toward those investments. But the same so-called second-generation reforms include, for example, labor market reforms. And again, the concept of reform is very loaded here. What that means, of course, is deregulation of labor markets and often limitation of formal workers' traditional rights in certain societies. So the question of what is the elective affinity or fit between these discourses is, I think, a very crucial and important one. Similarly, with the question of rights-based development, whether it constitutes a critique or a complement and how, I think would depend in part on how it's deployed. And it's a non-trivial question. So let me stop there.
Okay, thank you, Sanjay. I think it's also a good moment to bring it into this seminar. It was very, very interesting. You kept us a mirror of what we think and what others think and what we think is working. Maybe the point you raised about one of the last questions on was there enough discussion about the euro and the introduction of the euro? Well, having lived that myself, and maybe others can agree to that, I don't think there was a lack of discussion on the euro itself, or at least that there was no discussion. You can always argue it's enough, but there was lots of discussion. Maybe the way it was portrayed and the way politicians managed to portray it as sort of the crown jewel on top of the European integration process that it had happened, and that it built on a lot of cooperation in the monetary and the exchange rate management sphere already, that it seemed like a logical thing to do. Of course, and how you portray it and how it's working out may quickly change perceptions moving forward. I guess also that the brief wrap-up of the discussion we had, I think basically what the Washington Consensus conveys is this interface between what are key issues in theory, debates in theory, and how policies are being perceived, and what works and what does not work. In a way, you could say the Washington Consensus emerged over a reaction against what some would call an overemphasis also in economic and development policy making on equity issues and state-led intervention, and saying, well, drives you to greater inefficiency, and look what happened with the debt crisis and so on. And so let's put more emphasis on growth and efficiency driven by markets, which can do a job better than governments. So then, of course, the counter reaction to that was a lot of equity reason. Well, this is not working well because it drives up inequality and the way it works out. So you get that counter reaction to it. And I guess we're still in the middle of that discussion in between how much space should be given to the markets and how much can you trust governments to do a better job than markets in those driving equity and growth. But I guess the more recent emphasis and challenge is, I think Nazrul hinted at that in his question, well, how you can bring in sustainability, how would that work out, right? So is that something that can go hand in hand with those working on the growth and equity polars or priorities or principles the same way, or does it change that perspective? And I think that's what the New Economic Foundation tends to argue, saying, well, maybe we've had enough growth, and basically it's about distribution. And others would have a counterpoint to that. Well, as long as you can continue doing things more efficiently, so have growth, then it becomes more a matter of how you distribute the wealth, and also how you can make things done efficiently, also not just in the sense of pure economic sense, but in how you use natural resources without producing climate change, how you manage things without too much waste, because in a way greenhouse gas emissions are a form of waste that you would like to avoid. So I think it's this balancing act where we have to struggle with and how you do that. And I think your last point of your talk is, I think, the central message, I would say, in rethinking things and saying, well, this is no longer something you can resolve by purely thinking of national development strategies. It has to be done in collaboration with all parts of the world in order to make that happen. I guess what the answer to that is, well, I guess that's all of our struggle. So I guess maybe also as several of my colleagues have mentioned, so we're working on this new World Economic and Social Survey where we try and struggle ourselves with those questions, and maybe we can have a repeat of the seminar and see how far we've got along those lines. So thank you very much for helping stimulating the thinking, and I'm quite sure that we haven't heard the end of the story, and hopefully after the Washington Consensus, maybe by that time we have a new word for it, a new consensus that we can work with. So thank you all very much, and we'll hope to see you.